The committee will come to order. The chair notes the presence of a quorum. Pursuant to committee rules, members of the committee may submit written opening statements for the record. I ask that members may revise and extend the remarks on the bills to be considered at this markup and have those remarks included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. Pursuant to Committee Rule 3I, the chair announces that he may postpone further proceedings today on the question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote is ordered. Now I recognize myself for an opening statement. Good morning, and thank you for joining us today for these important bills. Congressman Crane's Energy Opportunities for All Act to reverse the Biden administration's mineral withdrawal, which deprives more than 5,400 Navajo Nation allottees of productive mineral rights, is moving under regular order today. We held a hearing on this legislation last week and heard from the Navajo Nation's president as well as a Navajo Nation allottee directly impacted by the Biden administration's decision to implement a 10-mile buffer zone around Chaco Canyon National Historic Park, which would lock up more than 10 times the size of the park itself. We'll discuss more about the specific legislation shortly, but I want to take a step back and examine the bigger picture. President Biden and his administration have clearly demonstrated a pattern of complete disregard for American energy and the millions of jobs and thousands of communities that depend on it. And the facts don't lie. In his first 2 years in office, President Biden leased the lowest number of acres for oil and gas drilling offshore and onshore than any other president dating back to the end of World War II. And I know some people would applaud that and say that's a good thing, but there's consequences for actions like that. Additionally, in his first year in office, oil production on tribal lands experienced its first decrease in several years, dropping by 11%. Yet while the administration has put the brakes on American energy production, it has done nothing to curb the world's demands for energy, and actually the demands for energy have done nothing but increase, which means it's somebody other than the producers in America who do it cleaner, safer, and more efficiently than anybody else in the world that's adding the extra volume to the world's demands. Since 1995, total world energy use has risen by 50%. And we have to ask the question, where will we be in 3 more decades? If we continue on the current trajectory, our need for energy will again balloon by 50%. And it's already increased, it's doubled 5 times since 1800. It's doubled 4 times since 1900. And that's an exponential increase of the world's demands for energy. It's not to say we can't produce all forms of energy, but I also don't think we can exclude forms of energy if we wish to meet these demands. No amount of rhetoric will change the reality that our entire world depends on reliable energy. While President Biden has had to go to our adversaries and asking them to produce more oil, our own resources are sitting untapped, underground, and locked up. It's absurd to me that we're content to sit back and let the world's polluters continue profiting at America's expense. Yet again, this committee is taking action to reverse harmful administration policies that raise costs and deprive American families of their livelihoods. Congressman Crane's bill will ensure that Navajo allottees and others in the region who depend on these oil and gas revenues will continue being able to responsibly access these resources to support their families and communities. I'm proud to support the legislation and the thousands of Navajo families whose property rights it restores. Today, we also have 2 bills moving under unanimous consent. H.R. 1607 would allow for the withdrawal of approximately 17,095 acres of federal land from the National Forest System to the Bureau of Reclamation for the development, generation, and transmission of electrical power and energy for the use of and benefit of the Salt River Project in Arizona. H.R. 2839 is a bipartisan House bill that would amend the Siletz Reservation Act to provide a process by which the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians and the state of Oregon can negotiate, amend, or replace the current agreement governing the tribe's hunting, fishing, trapping, and animal gathering rights. Each of these bills will empower local communities to do what they do best, responsibly manage their lands and resources. I'm honored to support this legislation and look forward to a good debate on these issues, and I'll now recognize Ranking Member Grijalva for any opening statements he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No opening statement. Save that discussion for, I think, the one bill that I'm in opposition, and the committees, our side is in opposition. That is the HR 4374. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Grijalva. It's now in order to consider H.R. 4374, the Energy Opportunities Act for All. Copies of the bill were circulated to members' offices in accordance with the committee's notice requirements. Ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources be discharged from further consideration of the bill. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Does any member wish to be recognized for purpose of debate on the bill?
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Stauber, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise today in support of H.R. 4374, the Energy Opportunities for All Act. During last week's hearing on this legislation, the Energy and Minerals Resources Subcommittee heard from the President of the Navajo Nation about the brazen disregard the Biden administration showed to the Navajo people in issuing the mineral withdrawal around Chaco Canyon. When the Navajo National Council passed a resolution earlier this year removing their support for a buffer zone of any size, it fell on deaf ears at the Department of Interior. In fact, the President of the Navajo Nation shared he wasn't even given a heads up about the department's mineral withdrawal. He had to hear about it on the local news. The Chaco Canyon withdrawal removed nearly 336,000 acres from mineral development in the San Juan Basin in New Mexico. Navajo Nation allottees stood to receive nearly $200 million over the next 20 years if oil and gas production were allowed to move forward. Those royalties would be life-changing for many of the Navajo people, as testified last week. Unfortunately, this is not new for the Biden administration. Earlier this year, Secretary Haaland issued a mineral withdrawal in my district in northern Minnesota, taking away over 225,000 acres of copper, nickel, cobalt, and platinum development. Again, without any regard for my constituents that would be impacted the most. It is clear that the Biden administration only cares about the views of the tribes and local communities when it is in line with their extreme, radical, anti-mining and anti-oil and gas agenda. It is so important that we advance this legislation today to undo yet another harmful policy from this activist Department of Interior. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting H.R. 4374 today. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any? Mr. Grijalva, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I oppose this legislation. The Chaco Canyon withdrawal was a meaningful step to protect the sacred site from further harm. I stand by the years-long effort of the administration, of the tribes, and of my congressional colleagues, and of the public to secure these protections. I respect the tribe's sovereign authority to develop their own resources, but when it comes to federal land, we need to take a balanced approach that takes all perspectives into account. If my colleagues across the aisle want to talk about tribal sovereignty, I would invite them to come to the table on requirements for the meaningful consultation of sacred places like Oak Flat. If they want to talk about economic development, let's talk about infrastructure investments, maintaining clean air and clean water so communities can thrive, and diversifying economies beyond just polluting fossil fuels. For too long, extractive industry has been left unchecked on federal land, leaving many communities no choice but to suffer with harmful pollution and degraded landscapes. But some places, like Chaco Canyon, which is a World Heritage Site, are too special to drill. The 10-mile buffer around Chaco will protect countless artifacts and this important landscape from further harm. This legislation undermines that. Even the Trump administration agreed to hold off on leasing due to tribal opposition and the need for more consultation. under both Secretary Zinke and Bernhardt. State lands in the region were withdrawn in 2019, and there has not been a federal lease sale in the area in more than 10 years. The Chaco Canyon withdrawal provides assurances that many tribes in the northwest New Mexico that consider this place sacred. We're hearing a lot of misinformation from the other side of the aisle. If my colleagues would take the time to review the information BLM has published in the environmental assessment, they would know that there has been thorough tribal consultation throughout this process, including with the Navajo Nation and Alatis. To make sure we are all clear, we're just submitted a question for the record to BLM, asking them to outline the outreach to the nation and to the Alatis. But it is evident that this process met a high standard for consultation. I look forward to the debate on the amendments, and I oppose this legislation. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion? I recognize
Mr.
Mr. Lamalfa, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, do we have any information on what the size of this canyon park is?
It's currently 34,000 acres, and it would be 336,000 acres under the new order.
So 10
My
times
understanding.
the size is what is that being asked to be withdrawn?
Correct.
That's, my quick math shows that's 525 square miles, which would represent a strip 52 miles long and 10 miles wide of, in order to protect an area ostensibly of 1/10 the size of that, which, is there artifacts in the entire area of the Chaco Canyon itself, or is there areas within that are really needing the attention? Do we know that?
I can just say that you're correct, and it's 10 times the size.
Yeah,
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to.
Yeah, so if you read the record, I believe it is 4,700, so 4,700 artifacts within the area that is to be withdrawn.
What is the footprint of that area again, please?
It's a 10-mile buffer around Chaco Canyon, but we need to remember that you can't just take that number and multiply, because it's only the federal lands, the trust lands, the state lands, the Alati lands. Those are not impacted by the withdrawal. So it's only the federal lands. It does not affect any other lands.
Okay, I thank you. Reclaiming my time. Well, indeed, it is a checkerboarded pattern of land ownership there between whether it's private property or Navajo land or federal lands. And so if you have the federal government basically tying up all that land, you're not going to have the opportunity to access it due to the checkerboard pattern and a lack of an access. So this is a pretty big club being swung when we're talking about that kind of amount of acres, 336,000. So I think we should be a lot more cautious with that, and I'll be supporting the legislation. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion? Ms. Ledger-Fernandez, you're recognized.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman. And I believe the legislation also makes clear that existing roadways and infrastructure, that those will continue to be allowed. And I want to acknowledge that the testimony of the president and the Alatis raising the issue of economic development and infrastructure in the area. I will have an amendment addressing their statements. I also want to point out that in a 2018 letter to support legislation that permanently protects the Chaco region, it actually began with former Navajo President Begay, where he wrote, I begin, quote, "We believe in protecting our native cultural resources because they are invaluable, historical, irreplaceable, and embody a strong spiritual significance for the Indian tribes in the region. As such, we consider any further disturbance to this area as culturally and morally unacceptable," end quote. And that was Navajo Nation President Begay. Last week, I also received testimony from former Navajo Nation Council delegate in Alati, Daniel So, who said, "As a Diné person, my life ways and spiritual ways are profoundly connected to the landscape. Like many members of my community, my cultural traditions depend on being able to visit sacred places in the greater Chaco region," end quote. So I think that what we're looking at here is the idea that the greater Chaco landscape, it's simply irreplaceable, where we might have a molecule of gas, looks the same wherever it comes from. There might be some differences, but this landscape is irreplaceable and is used on a regular basis. I already pointed out that this is only impacting new oil and gas development on federal lands. In fact, the department testified last week that they continue to hold lease sales for Alati minerals in the areas, including in 2022. And I know that this issue is not easy, it's not simple, and I respect the positions of all the tribal leaders and members that are connected to this really incredible landscape. And I urge everyone to visit it. It is stunning. And with that, I yield back and look forward to ongoing discussions, Mr. Chairman.
The lady yields back. Is there further discussion? I now recognize myself for a discussion on the bill. And, H.R. 4374 that is sponsored by Representative Crane would nullify the Bureau of Land Management's Public Land Order 7923, which, as we've discussed, implemented a new oil and gas leasing moratorium within 10 miles of Chaco Canyon National Historic Park, which is in northwest New Mexico. It would deprive many local mineral rights holders of an important source of economic opportunity. And as Mr. Lamalfa mentioned, the park is already 34,000 acres, but this public land order would withdraw an additional 336,000 acres of federal land and minerals, which is, again, roughly 10 times the size of the park. And this, as we heard in testimony, this action will prevent Navajo Nation Alatis in the area from accessing oil and gas reserves that they rely on to meet their basic needs. It's estimated that the total withdrawal would cost Navajo Nation Alatis $194 million over the next 20 years, and it would cost American taxpayers over $1 billion. And I put a lot of stock in the testimony from people who are directly affected by these actions, and that's why I think it's appropriate that I remind the committee of the direct words of Ms. Delora Jesus, who is a Navajo Nation Alati, who expressed her discontent with the administration's actions. And she said in her testimony, and I quote, "Have had our sole means of modest income, oil and gas payments from our Indian allotted minerals interest de facto stripped away by Public Land Order 7923, the Chaco 10-mile buffer withdrawal," end quote. That's unfortunate, but it's not surprising that these concerns were ignored by the Department of Interior as it continues to push forward a keep it in the ground policy. In our legislative hearing on this bill, the Bureau of Land Management's witness admitted that the administration moved forward with this withdrawal to the completion of cultural resource investigations that were commissioned by Congress in 2019. These cultural resources investigations were funded in order for Congress and the administration to better understand what resources are in the area, so the calculated decision on how to manage these resources could be made. I think our colleague, Mr. Gosar, put it best when he said that DOIs moving forward with their mineral withdrawal without the completed reports make it look like the decision to implement a 10-mile buffer zone was predetermined and that the public comment process was simply a check-the-box exercise. And to wrap up my testimony, or my statement, I want to again quote from Ms. Jesus' testimony when she said, and again I quote, "H.R. 4374 would correct a wrong, PLO 7923, that puts many of our mineral rights off limits and stops a much-needed source of income to feed, shelter, clothe, and protect our families. I urge the committee to pass this bill. I and 20,000 other Navajo Alatis have no idea how we will make ends meet if you don't," end quote. With that, I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this bill and righting this wrong. I yield back the balance of my time and ask if there's any further comments on the bill. Hearing none, it is now in order to consider amendments on H.R. 4374, and I recognize the gentlewoman from New Mexico, Ms. Ledger Fernandez, for the purpose of offering her amendment designated Ledger Fernandez number 1. Without objection, the amendment is considered read.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Gray,
I reserve a point of order.
state your point. He's reserved. Okay, you're reserving a point. You're recognized.
Thank you. So my amendment simply states that notwithstanding any of the other provision, the Section 2 of the Act shall not go into effect until the Secretary of Interior certifies that Section 2 shall not harm or impede the safe and free exercise of religion. And I think that the ability to honor distinct religions and the manner in which people pray, the manner in which they feel connected to a creator, to somebody that is larger than each of us and is an individual is important. And in fact, it's because Chaco is so special that there hasn't been a federal lease issued in the withdrawal area for around a decade. I would note that this includes the 4 years of the Trump administration. They also didn't issue any federal leases. And there was a unified message that we heard during last week's hearing, and it is that Navajo and Pueblo people have a deep and special relationship with the greater Chaco region. When I was a younger attorney, and we were putting on testimony about a very important cultural site, the judge, in speaking to the war chief who was a witness, he said, well, you tribes believe that everything is sacred and that we can't protect everything. And the war chief was very wise in many ways, but he also said that that's a fallacy. The sites that they were seeking to protect wasn't like trying to protect Madison Avenue, but rather he noted that it would be like trying to protect St. Patrick's Cathedral. There are certain places that just are very special to those who worship in them. And according to Interior, as I pointed out earlier, there are 4,700 known archaeological sites located outside of the national park, but in the 10-mile withdrawal area. And there was a lot of discussion as to what would be the appropriate area and how to best protect all of the resources. But it's because of the tribes and the individual tribal members' sacred relationship, and as I noted, the irreplaceable nature of the Great Chaco region that I offer this amendment today. Because sacred cultural resources can be directly tied to religion and belief systems and an ongoing practice, it simply states that the bill shall not go into effect until the Secretary certifies that doesn't harm that. And these cultural resources are not adequately protected through the NHPA or NEPA. These laws are helpful, but they really lead to really are focused more on has there been consultation, has there been a consideration of them, rather than a true protection. As one example, the Pierre site, an ancestral Pueblo archaeological village along the Great North Road of Chaco Canyon, is right now surrounded by energy development. When you climb on the mesas and look out at the Chaco landscape, you can literally see the direction of the roads that led to the 4 historical cultural areas that people hold sacred in the area, including Mount Taylor, which was presented to our state historical office and protected as a cultural site. That petition was brought by both the Navajo, the Acoma, the Zunis, and others as a collaborative effort. Former Pueblo of Acoma Governor Brian Bayo put it well when he wrote, and I believe that's also in the record, that many of these cultural resources remain unidentified in the greater Chaco region. While archaeologists are adept at recognizing many types of archaeological research, potsherds, room blocks, pit houses, etc., many of the cultural resources important to the Pueblo are outside the domain of archaeology because they remain in the domain of that which is sacred. And I think many of us on this panel understand the importance that religion and faith plays in our lives. So with that, Mr. Secretary, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question to the sponsor of the amendment. So I'm reading the amendment, and it says that
Mr. Graves, does the gentleman withdraw his point of order?
I wanted to ask a question, and I may.
Proceed.
Thank you. I wanted to understand, so it says that nothing can be implemented until the Secretary determines that nothing harms or impedes the safe and free exercise of religion. And I would argue that the First Amendment applies, and so that would already be protected. And I just want to understand from the sponsor, is it your argument that the First Amendment would not apply in this case and would not protect the free exercise of religion for the tribal members?
Well, I think what we need to look at is that's looking at free speech and what we really, and the protection of religion. And we need to point out that we are trying, the administration is seeking to withdraw these areas in order to protect the cultural sites, but those cultural sites are actually tied to active exercise of religion. And because of that, I think it is important to place that in there so that this bill does not go into effect until there is actually an understanding as to the ability to exercise the free exercise of religion by those who hold these places sacred.
So the Constitution applies or doesn't apply?
The Constitution always applies. The Constitution always applies, but the question is there a mechanism to protect that exercise? And this will be that mechanism.
I'm not sure I understand the distinction there, but I appreciate the gentlelady's explanation. Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my reservation and point of order.
Without objection.
I have the Constitution.
Is there any further discussion on the amendment? I recognize myself, and I oppose this amendment. The amendment would prevent the bill from nullifying the Biden administration's egregious withdrawal until the Secretary determines that the bill would not harm or impede the safe and free exercise of religion, which may sound good on the surface, but let's just put aside the logical fallacy that under this amendment, the Secretary who just promulgated the withdrawal gets to decide if it stays or not. This amendment is a red herring. We've already seen this administration bulldoze tribal families enacting the withdrawal, depriving them of livelihoods and property rights, and now our colleagues purport to care about that the Democrat administration cares about their well-being. As I mentioned in my opening statement, the administration did not wait for the completion of the cultural resources investigation, nor did they listen to Navajo Alatis or the Navajo government throughout the process. This shows that the agency and the Secretary had a predetermined course of action and that they are not being objective with respect to this matter. Are we to expect that they won't do it again? Are we to expect that if this amendment passed, they would be objective? I hardly think so. I think they would use this language to keep the withdrawal in place regardless of the realities of the people who will actually suffer. Additionally, on top of the argument my friend Mr. Garrett made about the protection of religion under the First Amendment, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978 protects the rights of Native Americans to exercise their traditional religions by ensuring access to sites, use and possession of sacred objects, and the freedom to worship through ceremonials and traditional rites. Nothing in this bill changes that fact. This is a messaging bill, or a messaging amendment intended to get the bill in a bad spot and give the Biden administration another opportunity to make a predetermined decision without listening to the American people that their decisions will hurt. Again, I oppose this amendment. Now I yield back and ask if there's any further discussion on the amendment.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Grahal, you're recognized.
Let me yield to the sponsor of the amendment.
So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your remarks on the amendment. I think that part of what struck me is the concept of that the idea that's predetermined. But what we know is that there was actually a lot of work a lot of consultation, visits, and that this has been ongoing. Indeed, similar legislation has passed the House with some Republican support, I believe. And so it is not, what the Secretary has done, it didn't come from, a very short process. It's actually been a fairly long process with consultation with many people on the ground in New Mexico. But thank you very much for the points that you've raised.
Go back.
The gentleman yields back. If there's no further discussion, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from New Mexico, Ms. Ledger Fernandez, designated Ledger Fernandez number 1. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. A recorded vote has been requested.
Thank you.
Further proceedings on the amendment, Ledger Fernandez number 1, will be postponed.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I offer an amendment to HR.
The gentlelady's recognized for the purpose of offering her amendment designated Ledger Fernandez number 2.
Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
The gentleman reserves a point of order. The gentlewoman from New Mexico, Ms. Ledger Fernandez, is recognized for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. In the hearing last week, I listened to the fact that in northwest New Mexico and surrounding this area, there has been a failure of economic development. It has been based on an extractive economy, which doesn't actually build, it doesn't build an economic engine within the area. And so when extractive economies end or are impacted, there isn't the structure that continues. And it is not right that there is such striking poverty, health disparities, crumbling infrastructure. The fact that there isn't access to clean water, running water, people truck their water in, electricity is lacking, paved roads. If you've driven on those roads, you also know that they are so beat up because of the heavy oil and gas trucks and that cover there. And we need good paying jobs that are long lasting in the area. And we need it across Navajo Nation, from Gallup to Shiprock to Farmington to Nageezi. And I think we all need to work together to create those opportunities. Last Congress, we passed the bipartisan infrastructure law, which invested $13 billion in Indian country, and we're seeing the results. Last month, I was on Navajo land together with Navajo officials and the Diné, where we celebrated $300 million that I was able to secure for the Navajo Gallup Water Supply Project. We are connecting homes that had never been connected before with that project. The Cutter Lateral, just imagine a spigot is finally being opened where people will be able to actually turn on running water in their home and everything that entails. But the Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS and Science, those are opportunities for us to build. And so my amendment would require the Department of the Interior and other federal agencies to work with the Navajo Nation to develop and carry out an economic development plan to create jobs and improve infrastructure. We have to be better. We must do more. However, I understand that this amendment will be deemed not germane to this particular bill. But I can tell you that I am committed to working on the economic development plan. I am committed to continue to work on the need to develop an economic strategy for rural America, for rural New Mexico, for tribal America. And so I will withdraw my amendment, Mr. Chairman. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my reservation and point of order.
The reservation of a point of order is withdrawn. Without objection, the amendment designated Ledger Fernandez number 2 is withdrawn. No additional amendments have been filed. Are there further amendments to H.R. 4374? Hearing none, it is now in order to consider the unfinished business on H.R. 4374. As you all are aware, we have a joint session of Congress. We do believe we have time to give a 15-minute notice and get folks back by 10:10 to have votes. That's the only thing left. So I declare the committee in recess until further notice. The unfinished business is a request for recorded vote on amendments to H.R. 4374. Members will record their votes using the electronic vote system. The question is on the amendment to H.R. 4374 offered by the gentlewoman from New Mexico, Ms. Ledger Fernandez, designated Ledger Fernandez number 1, on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will open the vote. Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? Hearing none, the clerk will close the vote and report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 15 and the nays are 21.
The amendment is not adopted. The question now occurs on reporting H.R. 4374 to the House with the recommendation that the bill be favorably approved. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported. A recorded vote has been requested. Members will record their vote using the electronic voting system. The clerk will open the vote. Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? Hearing none, the clerk will close the vote and report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 22 and the nays are 16.
The bill is ordered reported to the House with the recommendation that it be favorably approved. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Mr. Grijalva, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I give notice of my intention to file supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views on the measure just considered I ask unanimous consent that this notice be extended to all measures considered under this markup. Under House Rule 11, Clause 2L, this notice extends to all members. I yield back.
Without objection. We now turn to the UC package with the cooperation of Ranking Member Grijalva and the other members of the committee. It appears that we have worked out an agreement on two bills scheduled for markup today. As we have done before, rather than going through a formal markup process for each of the bills, I will make a single unanimous consent motion to report out the bills favorably with any amendments that have been filed and agreed to. Before we begin, does any member seek time to speak on any of the bills in this unanimous consent motion? Seeing none, I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee Water, Wildlife, and Fisheries be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 1607 to clarify jurisdiction with respect to certain Bureau of Reclamation pump storage development and for other purposes. Without objection, so ordered. Ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Indian and Insular Affairs be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 2839 to amend the Sulitz Reservation Act to address the hunting, fishing, trapping, and animal gathering rights of the Confederated Tribes of Sulitz Indians and for other purposes. Without objection, so ordered. I now ask unanimous consent that the following bills be approved and favorably reported as described to the House of Representatives. H.R. 1607 to clarify jurisdiction with respect to certain Bureau of Reclamation pump storage development and for other purposes, and with an amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the chair designated Westerman 35 A&S, and H.R. 2839 to amend the Sulitz Reservation Act to address the hunting, fishing, trapping, and animal gathering rights of the Confederated Tribes of Sulitz Indians and for other purposes. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the motions to reconsider are laid upon the table. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be allowed to make any technical and conforming changes to the documents the committee just adopted, subject to the approval of the minority. Without objection, so ordered. If there's no further business, the committee stands adjourned.